are in Acts chapter 16. What a mighty God we serve. Glory to his name. Acts chapter 16. We're in verse 24. When you get there, please let me know that you're there by saying amen. Amen. Acts 16 to 24. Having received this order, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. And the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly, somebody say suddenly, there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaking. And immediately, all the doors were opened, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. For the next few moments, I want to talk to you from the subject, when suffering meets suddenly. When suffering meets suddenly. Take your seats. Today we're beginning a brand new series entitled In the Storm. And the goal of this series is to instruct all of us on how to view and endure suffering. As your pastor, it is my to think biblically about this topic, because suffering is an inevitable part of the journey. All right. I don't care how much you pray. I don't care how much you come to church. I don't care how much scripture you know. I don't care how much you give. You will not be able to eliminate suffering from your life's experience. If you are not suffering now, then it's probably because you just got done suffering, or it's because you're headed into suffering. There is no way, as long as we are on this earth, that we will be able to escape suffering. And if we do not have a biblical view of suffering, then we are susceptible to becoming a victim of the sting and the pressure that comes along with suffering. In my lifetime, I have seen numerous professing Christians go into suffering, and because they do not have a biblical view of suffering, they end up losing their mind and their faith in the process. I have seen people deal with such hardship that they go into their suffering as a professing Christian and they come out as an atheist. When you don't have a clear and biblical view of suffering, suffering can be very demoralizing and destabilizing. So throughout this month, I want to build into you a biblical view. And my hope is that we reject what this culture says about suffering. And my hope is that we reject how this culture views suffering, because typically this culture views suffering as a bad thing.
Yes, sir.
There are books written and tons of lectures out there, and even a whole bunch of sermons on how to avoid suffering.
Yes, sir.
There are a whole bunch of books and lectures on how to get out of suffering once you are in suffering.
All right.
But this series is not going to be about avoiding suffering.
All right.
This series this month is not going to be about getting out of suffering once you are in suffering. This series is going to be about helping you to view and experience suffering biblically.
All right.
See, because I don't need the preacher to tell me how to escape suffering. The reality is I'm not going to be able to escape suffering. I need to know how to approach and endure suffering. I need to know how to endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ.
Yes, sir.
And so all this month, we'll be talking about life in the storm.
All right.
In our text this morning, we see two men experiencing extreme hardship, difficulty, and suffering.
Yes, sir.
And these two men, Paul and Silas, serve for us today as a wonderful example of, and witness of what it looks like to suffer well.
That's right.
But before we jump into the text and start walking our way through, I have to give you some context and let you know how Paul and Silas got in this predicament. When you get a chance, I want you to read verses 16 through 23 of Acts chapter 16. And there you will see that as Paul and Silas are ministering around the Macedonian countryside, they're being followed by a demonized young girl. And this demonized young girl, as she followed them, she was shouting out, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And she was right. She was right in what she was shouting out about Paul and Silas. However, the problem is that she shouted this out incessantly. The Bible says day by day, as she followed Paul and Silas, she shouted behind them, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And maybe the first 2 or 3 times, it was okay and it was cool for her to shout it out. But how many of you know that after being followed around day after day after day with this young girl shouting this out, that can wear on your nerves? So Paul got fed up. He got irritated with this young girl following him and shouting this out. And so he casted the devil out of her. And immediately, by the power of God, this young girl became free of this spirit of divination that she had. And you would think that everybody would rejoice, because now this girl who was demonized is now free. But when you get round about to verse 19 of Acts chapter 16, you discover that this young girl was a slave. And she had owners who were making profit off of her demon possession. And then now that she was free, they couldn't present her and profit off of her, because now she didn't have the demon that allowed her to see into the future and to give palm readings and things of that nature. They used her for divination, and now that she was free, they could no longer use her for that purpose. So their cash cow was now defective. And they got mad. They got mad at Paul and Silas. So much so they riled up the entire region, to the point where Paul and Silas were arrested. And not only were they arrested, but Paul and Silas were beaten. And they were thrown in prison. And it kind of makes you scratch your head, because they hadn't broken any laws. Paul and Silas hadn't done anything to hurt or harm nobody. Actually, they had helped that young girl. But yet, as a result of helping the young girl, They were arrested, beaten, and thrown in prison, which gives us the first thing that we have to understand about suffering. Listen to me. Suffering isn't always a punishment for something bad. Sometimes suffering is the result of something good or godly that has occurred. Suffering isn't always an indication that you've done wrong. Sometimes suffering is the very sign that you've done right. And it's because you've done right that you're going through the hell that you are going through. Paul and Silas were beaten and thrown in prison. And in verse 24, our text this morning, we see the horrid nature of their imprisonment. Let's look at verse 24 again. Let's work our way through this. Look at verse 24. Having received this order, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. Now stop right there. Paul and Silas weren't just thrown into prison. They were put, according to the text, in the inner prison. If you know anything about first century Roman prisons, then you know that the inner prison was dark, and it was dank, and it was musty, and the air circulation was bad. And this was literally where they put prisoners to send them to die. They would leave them in there to starve to death. And there was no escaping the inner prison. Paul and Silas were secure in that inner prison. There was no way that they could have gotten out of the inner prison. However, to add insult to injury, not only did they throw them into the inner prison, but the text says they put their feet in stocks. Stock is this wooden board with two holes cut out of it, and they would put the feet of the prisoners in both of the holes to restrict their movement. Oftentimes these holes were too small. Circulation would be cut off at the feet. It would be extremely uncomfortable and unbearable. So not only Paul and Silas in prison, they were in the inner prison. And not only were they in the inner prison, they were in the inner prison with their feet in stocks. And here we have to understand what is sometimes a bitter truth about suffering, and it is this. Sometimes, Brother Taylor, sometimes, brothers and sisters, things get worse before they get better. It was bad enough for Paul and Silas to be arrested. But they weren't just arrested, they were beaten. And it's bad enough that they were arrested and beaten. But they weren't just arrested and beaten, they were thrown into prison. And it's bad enough that they were thrown into prison, but they weren't just thrown into any old prison. They were thrown into the inner prison. And it's bad enough to be arrested, beaten, thrown into the inner prison, but they didn't stop there. Their feet were placed in stocks. And for Paul and Silas, the night got a whole lot darker before the day came. And listen, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news this morning. I don't want to put a dark cloud over our heads, but I need to be real with you this morning. And I need to be honest with you this morning. Sometimes things get darker before the sun comes out. Sometimes things get bad. And I mean real bad. And I mean really bad, before they start to turn around and become good. Sometimes the loss of a job leads to a loss of a house. Sometimes you go into the doctor because you have a small pain and end up getting admitted for something serious. Sometimes the counseling sessions ultimately lead to divorce court. Sometimes things get worse before they get better. And I'm not trying to sell you any false hope. I didn't start this series so that I could get shouts and hoots and hollers. I started this series because I wanted to level with you. If you're suffering, it could get worse. and Silas were in a predicament that seemed to go from bad to worse to worser. I know it ain't a word, but that's what happened. But look at Paul and Silas's posture as things are going from bad to worse. Verse 25. About midnight. I like the way the King James says it. The King James comes in and says, and at midnight, Paul and Silas, even though things were going from bad to worse, even though they were still licking their wounds from the beating that they received just moments ago, even though they had their feet in stocks and their movement was restricted, at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing praise unto God. Now, I imagine Paul and Silas in the prison, looking around saying, we're beat up. We're still licking our wounds. There's a Roman guard outside. We can't hardly move because our feet are in stocks. And although our bodies may be locked up, that will not make us shut up. Because as long as we have breath in our bodies, it doesn't matter what the predicament is. I may be locked up, but I don't have to shut up. And let me tell you something, Macedonia. Suffering may come with the loss of your money. Suffering may come with the loss of your relationship. Suffering may come with the loss of your reputation. But suffering should never come with the loss of your prayer and your praise. I'm wondering if there's anybody in here that can learn how to praise God and pray no matter what the predicament. I'm wondering if there's anybody in here that doesn't matter whether it's noonday or nighttime. You just notice the text. Notice the text. They do not have an assurance, Minister Knox, that they will go free. But they're still praying and praising. They were not visited by the angel of the Lord that told them that their deliverance was nigh. But yet there they were, praying and praising. Which helps me to know that true spiritual maturity is not being able to pray and praise after you get out of suffering. True spiritual maturity is about being in the belly of the beast. True spiritual maturity is about all hell breaking loose all around you. True spiritual maturity is about things going haywire, and yet you still lift your hands and you still open your mouth and you say, I'm gonna give him glory anyhow. It doesn't matter how dark the night, it doesn't matter how crazy the situation, I will bless the Lord. Do me a favor, touch your neighbor, tell him you gotta learn how to praise him anyhow. You gotta learn how to praise him anyhow. You gotta learn in whatever situation to give God glory. You gotta be able to give him glory in this and in that. When the money is high, when the money is low. When the body is well, when the body is sick. When the friends are here and when the friends go. When the job is good and when the job gets crazy, I will bless the Lord. They Well, let's look at it in the text.
Yes, sir.
Verse 26 says, and suddenly
And suddenly,
there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken.
yes, sir.
And immediately all the doors were open,
Yes, sir.
and everyone's bonds were unfastened. So here are Paul and Silas. They're praying,
Yeah.
singing hymns. The other prisoners are listening. And all of a sudden, there comes a shaking. All of a sudden, there comes a rumbling. All of a sudden, an earthquake occurs as they're praying and singing. Let me just say this here as a sidebar. For all you new school saints that think that the only way to have an effective prayer and praise service is to have a whole bunch of technology. All you new school saints that think that you're not having an effective prayer and praise service unless you have the hottest mics and the biggest choir and screens with words and lasers and smoke. Can I tell you that Paul and Silas didn't have no mics? They didn't have a keyboard. They didn't have a choir. They didn't even have a church house. All they had was faith. And they took their faith and started praying and praising. They had a prayer service that literally provoked an earthquake. I don't need such an everything. Don't take all that. All you got to do is have some faith and late in the midnight hour without a choir, without a microphone, without a keyboard, without a preacher. They started praying, and it started shaking, and the earthquake was so powerful that it rattled all the chains of the prisoners free. What we see in Acts chapter 16, verses 24 through 26, is the epitome of the saying, when the praises go up. I dare somebody to just begin praising God right now. I don't know what you came in here with. I don't know what your situation is outside of this church. But my Bible tells me that He inhabits the praise of His people. I dare you to take about 30 seconds and give God a praise. Come on and praise Him out of your pain. Praise Him through your tears. Praise Him in spite of your suffering. Yes! Yes! Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. The earthquake loosened the bonds, not just of Paul and Silas, but of all who were in prison. And just as I told you earlier in this sermon, I'm not in this series trying to sell you false hope. And I'm not in this series trying to paint some grand picture of life that doesn't exist. But what I want to tell you is that the reason why Paul and Silas experienced suddenly in their suffering was because even though they were in chains, the chains weren't in control. Well, I feel like shouting. Even though there was a Roman guard outside of the prison, the Roman guard was not in control. Even though there was a Roman emperor who had commanded the Roman guard, the Roman emperor was not in control. The reason why they experienced a suddenly in their suffering is because through it all, God is still in control. And I hear about 5 people in this place to give God glory because He's in control. He holds on, yo. Come on. He holds on, yo. Do me a favor, help me preach the sermon. Touch about 3 people and tell them God's got that. God's got that. God's got, He's got that. He's got that. He's got that. No matter what that is, God's got that. I don't care what the situation is. God's got it. You don't have to worry. And you don't have to fret. God, He's in control. He's in control. Well, Pastor Isaiah,
Yes, sir.
what about the devil? Well, let me tell you something about the devil. When the devil got ready to afflict Job, he first had to ask God for permission. Yes, the devil is walking around this earth like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. But let me tell you something, the devil is on a leash. See, some of you didn't grow up in the hood like I grew up in the hood. You knew that every hood had that one dog. When you passed by the house of that one dog, you knew that you were safe. As long as it was on the leash, no matter how bad the dog was, the dog couldn't go any further than the leash would allow. And I want to let you know that the devil is on a leash. And you want me to tell you who's at the end of the leash? He's the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. He's the bright and morning star. He can't do, the devil can't do what God won't allow him to do. I dare you to wave your hand and thank God. The devil is defeated. I'm not going to tell you this morning that you're going to experience the same suddenly that Paul and Silas did. But what I am telling you is that as long as God is in control, whether you get a suddenly or whether God has you in the slow cooker, whether it ends today or whether you got to go through for the rest of your life, God knows what He's doing. God's got everything in control. And it doesn't matter what the situation is. We serve a God that can turn suffering into suddenly. I'm so thankful this morning that my bills aren't in control. I'm so thankful this morning that the doctor is not in control. I'm so thankful this morning that my boss is not in control. There is a king on the throne. And so because He is in control, we can pray and sing hymns in the most dire situation. Because he's in control. We can pray and sing hymns because we may not know what tomorrow holds, but we know who holds tomorrow. We can pray and sing praise because we know that God is in control. I often watch documentaries about the civil rights struggle that our people endured. I see in those documentaries not just young people. The young people were involved. Thank God for the young people that marched and protested. But look, watch those documentaries. You will also see older people involved in those marches. Older people who knew that things probably wouldn't change during their lifetime. Older people who knew that the Jim Crow laws probably wouldn't be repealed as long as they had breath in their body. But they still marched. They still prayed. They still sang. Because they knew that it may not happen today. And it may not happen tomorrow. But there's a God in heaven that controls all things. And he's a righteous God. So whether I see his righteousness on this side or whether I see it on that side, I'm not going to stop praying. And I'm not going to stop praising. Because God is in control. We will suffer if we are not suffering right now. But remember the witness of Brother Paul and Brother Silas. Things went from bad to worse. But they stayed steadfast. Beaten, imprisoned, and bound. Faith sprang out like the noonday. God is in control and came through for them in their suffering. And the same God that was there then is in your situation right now. And so keep on praying. Keep on praising. I know there's no guarantee that the cancer will leave. Keep on praying. Keep on praising. You want to know why? Because to be absent from the body. So even if it is unto death, let me tell you that death is just a passageway into life abundantly. Keep on praying. Keep on praising. I guarantee you will know without a shadow of a doubt that the God you're praying to and praising is greater than your suffering. Let's all stand in the presence of the Lord.